Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome back. One of the biggest fixes here is that Legendary Hunt finally behaves the way it is supposed to. Before this, you could start a Legendary Hunt, do everything right, and still end up with the story cycle refusing to kick off, which is exactly the kind of thing that makes a player stare at the screen for a second and wonder what they missed. That has now been fixed. On top of that, the Iberian Dominance ending can no longer be repeated over and over for unlimited renown, which is important because anything that lets players farm a core resource forever is basically an open invitation for chaos. And honestly, that is the theme of this hotfix. It is mostly about closing loopholes, cleaning up event logic, and making sure systems do what they say they do. For example, the purchase land interaction has been tightened so that it only allows duchy targets when the seller completely controls that duchy, which sounds like a very specific fix because it is a very specific problem. The game is basically saying, no, you cannot sell a half-owned duchy and pretend everything is fine. Along the same lines, if you are playing landless, the purchase land interaction now properly distributes the land to the purchaser, which should help avoid those weird situations where the transaction looks successful but the result is not actually what it should be. There are also a bunch of dynasty and title management fixes in here, and these matter more than they might sound. Custom title names will no longer reset back to the default after a ruler dies, which is a huge relief for anyone who likes giving their realm a bit of personality and does not want that effort erased by succession. AI characters can now upgrade their knight accolades, which means the game's internal logic is a little healthier, and the non-player rulers should be making better use of that system instead of leaving it to gather dust. Rites of Passage also no longer refunds gold or prestige when cancelled, so there is no longer this odd little loophole where backing out of the interaction could behave like a money printer. A couple of story and content-related fixes are in here too, and these are the ones that players notice because they touch the actual narrative flow of a campaign. The Song of El Cid story cycle can now be finished properly, which is one of those, finally, that works. Fixes that probably saves a lot of frustration for anyone trying to see that content through. Administrative rulers who come from the renewed caliphate ending now correctly receive the subjugation casus belli, which means the post-ending gameplay state now lines up with the design instead of leaving people with a broken transition. Characters at their concubine limit can now offer concubines to other characters as well, which sounds like a tiny interaction fix, but is exactly the kind of thing that keeps the social machinery of the game from feeling sticky. The user interface side got some attention too. There was an issue where the side buttons in the character panel would not display correctly after loading the multiplayer save, and that has been fixed, so multiplayer sessions should feel a little less janky when you reload into them. Japan also now shows the correct title and government type when selecting a starting character, which is important because the start screen is basically the first impression the game gives you, and it needs to be accurate. Characters in a travel entourage now reset to their original location if the travel plan gets cancelled, which is another quality of life fix that helps the travel system behave in a cleaner, more predictable way. And then there is the famously cheeky line from the notes. Your infidelity will no longer be broadcast to everyone as it happens. It is the Middle Ages, not a Coldplay concert. That one is very on brand for Crusader Kings, and the best part is that the note also clarifies a little exception, because pregnancies that began in the previous hotfix will still trigger this behavior. So, the joke is there, but the edge case is still handled, which is exactly the sort of detail players need to hear, so they do not assume the fix applies retroactively to everything already in motion. If you step back from the individual lines, what this hotfix really does is polish the seams. It stops story content from getting stuck, closes economy exploits, corrects region and government display problems, protects title history from getting wiped, and makes a handful of interactions behave in a way that feels much more consistent with the rest of the game. That is why a patch like this matters, even though it is not packed with flashy new features. It is the kind of update that quietly improves the experience every time you load a save, trigger a story cycle, manage your realm, or try to move through the late game systems without the game tripping over its own logic.